Hi everyone, I would like to discuss um, reteaching classics in schools, and mostly for the schools like, from first grade to 12th grade, I mean, even college, but some of these strategies and all that we can use to teach. When I say reteach classics in terms of the one that makes them make emphasis on cultural differentiation, and at the same time that make emphasis on the experiences, the attitudes of majority towards minorities. In other words, the attitudes towards Native Americans, the attitudes towards African Americans, the attitudes towards a any minority that finds themselves within a dominant majority. You know, things like colonial experiences, post-colonial experiences. Um, when we teach classics, it is very important. I think if you just teach classics and you do not make an emphasis on the idea of racism or discrimination or how the racism plays in that story, students most likely will form their own opinion, which it can reinforce already pre-existing racial biases. And this could pertain to minority and majority because um, everyone tends to be raised in a certain preconceived um, biases against, you know, it doesn't have to be between majority and minority. It could be also between um, tribes. It could be between um, um, Africans and African Americans, for example, or it could be between Protestants and Catholics. For example, from the country where I come from, where we all are considered white, but yet there is that religious tension in former Yugoslavia, where the civil war happened. So there is that the whole history behind it, which people base their opinions based on a religion, discrimination, and resulted in a lot of bloodshed and civil wars through 1990s that just um, went on for 4 or 5 years of fighting and siege and massacres that happened and genocides that occurred. And this is not between a what you called this was not a racial um, per se, but it was more. It's a civil, but based on religious, based on cultural affiliations, and based on that. So if you these differences have to be taught, how these differences and how these differences play into classic work. We we can't just teach a classic. For example, if we teach Merchant of Venice and you give it to the students, and we know in Merchant of Venice that it developed certain views about Christianity, about Christians, but then it also developed certain anti-Semitic and anti-Jewish views and all that. So if you just give it to the students and they read it, and you don't explain the context of the society, you don't explain what Shakespeare is doing in that play, if you do not explain, but if you do not challenge the view that it's already been that students already have. Now, students come with a certain views and certain understanding based on what they're learning at home, or they're learning in a society, or they're learning and they bring it in school. So, the school should be very careful not to enforce that view. But and so one way to say, well, we're not going to teach classics, or we're going to remove classics, it does not solve the problem. Or teaching authors that predominantly were minority, or authors that presented the minority like Harriet Beecher Stowe in Uncle Tom's Cabin, or the Frederick Douglass biography, which is great, and you want to bring that experience, but at the same time, these historical events and experiences can reinforce the racism, it can reinforce the discrimination. So we have to distinguish that. We have to make sure that students, what they're learning from classics is what happened. That's how the society was. Today, we want to challenge that view and we want to change it. So that is kind of indirectly pairing students to talk about different issues that affect in a society, or things that makes them personal, or is it their language, is their disposition, is it their linguistical cultures, is it the background that they come from, and so when we teach classics, we also have to look about colonial times and how colonial perspectives have come into play, how colonial perspectives have come to shape the thinking of people. And then we have post-colonial times, which kind of ended that imperialistic thinking, but at the same time we have continued deep divide and residual effects that mutually exclude people. What do I mean by mutually exclude people? You have, for example, here in the United States, you have communities that have been so isolated. They do not want to mingle with the dominant culture because they're afraid they're going to lose their own culture. Well, okay, you could have a point, but the thing is that I think if you bring diversity and bring all those different experiences, you are enriching your own culture, you are enriching your own situation. It is not Christians versus Jews or Muslims versus Jews. If you bring all these different features that have a common elements, that have common grounding, can work together and can challenge the thinking of generations that come before us in order to change for the generations that come after us. And so removing history, or trying to retell the history from or trying to remove symbols like statues and sculptures and all that, instead of removing them, you can add, like for example, at the Museum of Natural History in New York, we have Theodore Roosevelt on a horse and Native and African American like supporting him. He's on a horse and they're walking with him, like he's superior and they're inferior. You could certainly argue that he is a racial, and that it presents racial discrimination. But at the same time, why couldn't we brought a sculpture of Frederick Douglass right next to the Theodore Roosevelt, and it offers these views. Look, the view that he was holding, or if he was holding, Theodore Roosevelt. Yes, I think later on he developed certain racial, but then he also protected labor and laborers in the houses that were, especially through New York, exploitation and all that stuff. But at the same time, if we present, so we take Theodore Roosevelt and then we take Frederick Douglass and we bring them up together as a sculpture next to each other, and so that people can see this is the history, this is the part of history, and this is what people thought at that time, this is how people felt at that time. But that does not mean we should feel that way today and all that. So at the same time, when we talk about classics, and so this is why a comparative reading of classics, where you have, for example, as I mentioned, Frederick Douglass, you can read, and then you can read some Confederate general, and you compare these views and you say, wow, how these views have affected and played together. So that comparative literature where the students are getting both ends of it, and but at the same time students are reminded that this is how society taught, this is how, these are the views, these are the things that led to civil rights, and these are the things that are leading today to many changes. Because we're going to be able to completely eradicate discrimination, racism, or any racism, because if whites are discriminating against, let's say, Mexicans, then Mexicans are discriminating against Africans, and then Africans are discriminating against African Americans. British are discriminating against Irish. All these differences. For example, in Balkan, where I come from, people discriminate against because they're Serbians and they are Orthodox and they are being discriminated, and then you have Muslims who have been discriminated, and then you have Croatians, and then you have all these different factions, and then you have Albanians in Kosovo, which is a whole different subject that plays out all these differences and brings up animosities among people. But I think comparative reading of text, especially for teachers, I think it's very important so that students can compare and contrast the views and maybe relate them to today, how these views might still be happening today and why are they happening today. So this is a meaningful. We cannot just give or remove classics or just teach classics from minorities' perspective. You got to teach classics from all different perspectives, meaning universal teaching that brings out all these different experiences on the light, and then it also, how does it shed the light to today's society. All right, well, I will continue to talk about this because this topic has become, when it comes to classics, I love classics, and because there's so much you can teach, and there's so much about, Shakespeare, Dostoevsky, Harriet Beecher Stowe, Uncle Tom's Cabin, all these different classics that really, really play major parts in society and how the society taught, and if anything has changed today. All right, that's all for right now. Thanks.